Every nation on the planet is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion, Japan owes over $9 trillion, and the entire world owes a staggering $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. But this raises a terrifying paradox. If every country owes money, who exactly is the creditor? The answer is not what you expect. When you trace the chain of ownership and follow who holds the debt, you find that the world doesn't owe money to some outside entity. It owes the money to itself. For powerful bankers across 3 centuries, designed it this way with deliberate precision. They engineered a system where debt is never meant to be repaid, where governments are locked into borrowing forever, and where interest payments flow endlessly upward. The very architects of this trap are the ones who profit from every transaction, every financial crisis, and every government bailout. This is not a conspiracy. It is documented history. The meetings are recorded, the charters exist, and the financial mechanisms are a matter of public record. Once you see the blueprint they created, you will understand that a $38 trillion debt isn't a failure of the system. It is the system functioning perfectly as intended. Let me introduce you to the 4 architects and the 4 crucial moments they engineered this inescapable debt trap that now holds every government on earth. Before the year 1694, rulers borrowed money in a straightforward manner. They would ask for loans from wealthy merchants or nobles and promise to repay the amount with interest. If they failed to pay, they defaulted. Lenders would lose their investment, and kings would have to find new creditors. This system was risky for lenders and often humiliating for monarchs, but the consequences were contained. Debt was a temporary condition. It was either paid back or defaulted on, and the system would reset. William Paterson changed all of that. He was a Scottish merchant and financial strategist who, after several failed ventures, devised an idea in 1691 that would alter the course of civilization. At the time, England was engulfed in a costly war with France, and King William III was desperate for funds. The royal treasury was barren, tax revenues were insufficient, and lenders were wary because of England's past defaults. Paterson saw an opportunity. He presented the king with a revolutionary proposal. He would assemble a syndicate of affluent merchants to lend the government £1.2 million. A colossal sum worth around $300 million in today's money. The true innovation was in the terms of the loan. The government would never have to repay the principal amount. Instead, it would make interest payments of 8% annually, forever. To oversee this perpetual arrangement, Paterson suggested the creation of a new entity, the Bank of England. The mechanics were groundbreaking. The merchants would deposit their gold into the Bank of England, which would then lend it to the government. The government would source its annual interest payments from tax revenue, and the bank would distribute this interest to the original lenders. The principal was never to be returned. Why would any lender agree to this? Because the interest was guaranteed by Parliament itself, backed by the full taxing authority of the nation. As long as the government could tax its people, the payments were secure. The banknotes the lenders held were not just receipts. They were tradable assets that earned interest, making them even better than money. In 1694, Parliament approved Paterson's plan, and the Bank of England was chartered. The government received its war funds, and for the first time in history, national debt was no longer a temporary liability to be resolved, but a permanent feature of the state. Here lies the brilliance of the design from the banker's perspective. The government's annual payment of £96,000 on the £1.2 million loan was an endless stream of income. The merchants had effectively purchased an annuity from the state. If they ever wanted their initial investment back, they could simply sell their interest-bearing notes to another investor. The debt was transferable but never-ending. But Paterson's true genius was the next step. The Bank of England was granted the authority to issue new paper money, backed not by gold, but by the government's debt. The government's IOU was transformed into currency. The more the government borrowed, the larger the money supply could become. This became the blueprint for modern finance. A government borrows, pays interest in perpetuity, and the debt itself becomes the foundation of the nation's money. It's a masterful system if you are a banker, but a disaster if you are a taxpayer, footing the bill for interest on a debt that will never be paid off. Within half a century, this model was replicated across Europe. By 1790, even the newly formed United States, under Alexander Hamilton, adopted a financial system explicitly modeled on the Bank of England, complete with permanent debt and interest paid from taxes. Paterson himself did not die a particularly wealthy man, but the system he created has persisted for over 300 years. The Bank of England still stands, and the British government's debt has never been eliminated. The trap was set in 1694. By the early 1800s, governments across Europe routinely borrowed for wars and infrastructure. However, there was no centralized market for this debt. Loans were negotiated one by one, interest rates were inconsistent, and only the most elite merchants could participate. Nathan Rothschild transformed his chaotic landscape by industrializing sovereign debt. The Rothschild family began as currency traders in Frankfurt, and by 1800, the five brothers had established a network of banking houses in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This unprecedented network allowed them to move money across borders faster than anyone else, giving them dominance over government financing. Nathan Rothschild, based in London, was the mastermind. During the Napoleonic Wars, he didn't just lend money to the British government, he created a secondary market for their bonds. He would buy government bonds at a discount and then resell them to a network of investors, including pension funds and insurance companies. The government received its money quickly. Rothschild profited from the price difference, and investors gained a tradable asset. But Rothschild's methods grew darker. He understood that controlling information was the key to controlling the market. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, his private courier network delivered the news of Napoleon's defeat to him in London before anyone else knew. He used this advantage to manipulate the bond market. First, he began selling British bonds, creating the false impression that Britain was losing. Panic selling ensued, and prices plummeted. Then, just as the market hit rock bottom, Rothschild bought up massive quantities of bonds for a fraction of their worth. When the official news of victory finally arrived, bond prices soared, and he made a fortune. This became the Rothschild model: control the flow of information, control the issuance of debt, and control the market. By 1820, the Rothschilds were the undisputed kings of European sovereign debt. Governments had little choice but to go through them to secure loans. Before Rothschild, a king could default on a loan, and the system would reset. But Rothschild's innovation made government debt internationally tradable. A British bond could be owned by a French investor, who might sell it to a German bank. This intricate web of ownership made defaulting a catastrophic event that could collapse the entire international financial system. The debt trap was no longer just permanent, it was inescapable. The Rothschild family became wealthier than any monarch, and their fortune was built on one thing: collecting interest on government debt. They didn't build or produce. They simply lent money to governments and collected their payments forever. By the turn of the 20th century, America was a rising economic power, but its financial system was still decentralized and tied to the gold standard. There was no central authority to manage the nation's debt. J.P. Morgan would change that. Not for the public good, but to secure his own banking empire. The financial panic of 1907 saw stock prices crash and banks fail. Morgan personally stepped in, gathering New York's top bankers in his library and forcing them to pledge their own funds to stabilize the system. He knew this was a temporary fix. Morgan and his associates then secretly designed a permanent solution. In 1910, they met on Jekyll Island, Georgia, to create what would become the Federal Reserve System. They knew that a central bank designed by bankers would be met with public outrage, so they disguised it. It was presented as a decentralized system of 12 regional banks, overseen by a presidentially appointed board. But the structure was a brilliant manipulation. The regional banks were privately owned by member banks, who elected their boards. The real power, the ability to create money and buy government bonds, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, controlled by Morgan's own Wall Street institutions. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1930, and the debt trap expanded exponentially. Now, the U.S. government could borrow directly from the Federal Reserve, which could create money out of thin air to purchase government bonds. This created unlimited demand for government debt. The government issues a bond, the Fed buys it with newly created money, and the debt is added to the Fed's balance sheet, backed only by the promise of future taxpayers. This is the engine of infinite debt. The Federal Reserve guarantees that there will always be a buyer for government bonds, so the government never has to stop borrowing. Morgan's legacy is the very structure that allows for the current $38 trillion U.S. debt. By the 1970s, this system was global. Developed nations were all caught in the cycle of borrowing and paying interest. But developing nations, who had borrowed heavily for infrastructure projects, were beginning to falter. The debt trap was about to reach its limit until Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve Chairman, made it truly permanent. Faced with rampant inflation in 1979, Volcker dramatically raised interest rates from 11% to 20%. This crushed inflation but had a devastating side effect. Developing nations, which had taken out dollar-denominated loans at low rates, now found their interest payments had tripled. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina were on the verge of collapse. In 1982, Mexico announced it could no longer make its payments. This should have triggered a global financial meltdown, as American banks held most of this debt. But Volcker orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The IMF provided new loans to these countries, but with brutal conditions. Governments were forced to cut public spending, privatize state assets, and devalue their currencies, effectively surrendering their economic sovereignty. The IMF loans didn't reduce the debt. They simply restructured it, making it manageable but permanent. This is the Volcker innovation. When a debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it. Restructure it, lend more money to keep the interest flowing, and in exchange, extract political and economic control. The debt trap had become a tool of global governance. This pattern has repeated for decades. Debt just keeps rolling on, from Greece in 2010 to Sri Lanka in 2022. So, here is how the system works. Paterson's model made government debt permanent. Rothschild's innovation made it globally interconnected, making default impossible. Morgan's mechanism created a central bank that could print money to buy government bonds, ensuring unlimited borrowing. Finally, Volcker's trap ensures that even when countries cannot pay, the debt is never forgiven, but restructured, keeping the interest flowing to the creditors. The result is the $315 trillion in global debt we see today. None of it is ever meant to be repaid. It all accrues interest, and it is all interconnected. A default anywhere threatens a collapse everywhere. The U.S. government's $38 trillion debt is owned by the American public through pension funds and banks, and by the government itself through programs like Social Security. The interest on this debt, about $1 trillion a year, is paid by taxpayers and transferred to the wealthy institutions that hold the bonds. It is a shell game, but the interest payments are very real. This system is now global. Every country operates on the same model, and their finances are all intertwined. Japan holds U.S. treasuries, and the U.S. holds European bonds through the IMF. It is a circular flow of debt where the interest always moves upward. This system can never end. If the U.S. were to pay off its debt, the money supply would collapse, triggering a global depression. Debt has become a structural necessity. The ultimate beneficiaries are the financial institutions that manage this debt. Asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard control tens of trillions of dollars. They use other people's money to buy government bonds and collect the interest year after year. It is the largest and most invisible transfer of wealth in human history. The four architects of this system did not conspire together across centuries, but each one, in his own time, solved a problem in a way that benefited bankers, and each solution built upon the last. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. And Volcker made it inescapable. Together, they constructed a world where governments borrow endlessly. And the people who control that debt reap the eternal rewards. The $38 trillion debt is not a crisis for them. It is a business model. As long as people believe the government will continue to pay interest, even without ever repaying the principal, the system will function. The trap is complete, and there is no way out without dismantling the entire global financial system. If you now understand that this mountain of debt is not an accident but a meticulously designed system, then you are beginning to see how power truly works. They will teach you in school that debt is a problem to be solved. But the architects knew the truth. Debt isn't the problem, it's the foundation. And the interest we pay is the rent for living in their world.